So another way to consider this, here's me and here's everybody else living in this world, is to understand that these are merely roles that get played out in the world. Where does that come from? It's as if the hand projects fingers and then lines each one up and assigns them a role. One role is myself, another role could be a Jesus, a Buddha, a Hitler. All the people that we interact with, everything that we know are merely roles that are assigned by the hand. What do those roles have in common? We understand that with the experience of withdrawing from everything, there is this experience of nothing. And to compensate for that experience of nothing, a story is made up of guilt, of terror, of shame, and that becomes the fist that then needs the fingers to project out, as if this was almost like lava needing a place to escape from, and then the volcanoes appear. And so while we don't experience it that way because we don't see where it all comes from, and what we do then experience up here though is that guilt and terror, that explosive lava that comes out through the volcanoes. What they also share in common is this experience of lack. When I cut myself off from everything and have nothing and conjecture up a story, all of the individual people up here experience lack. And so what I'm seeking for is praise or oxygen and water, nutrition, housing, anything to compensate for my experience of lack. That lack carries out too in wishing that I was a Jesus, or I was a CEO of a company, or I was a rock star, or I was somehow different and better and other than me, or conversely, that thank God I'm not like all those other fingers. So the roles all have in common the same guilt, shame, terror being projected out and then appearing to be separate for the experience of acting out significance and specialness again on another level. Here's the first experience of significance. Unfortunately, it is that experience of terror and shame. And then because that becomes unbearable, it gets projected out, and here's me and here's everybody else. So it becomes a little bit easier to understand when I understand that these are roles. I can rebel against them. I can feel as if I didn't ask for this, that this wasn't given to me, and there are better roles and worse roles. But when I begin to understand where it all comes from and the similarity that it all has in acting out the very same agenda, having the very same source, in fact, having been assigned by that very same source to act out an orchestration of the significance based on the terror and the shame that distinguishes me from nothing and blocks out the memory of truth. Sometimes just using movies too, if we were to be able to kind of combine Groundhog Day and Interstellar, we could understand that everything up here is just a fantasy and is a repetition over and over again of the same ideas, that time and space collapse in on themselves, so it's actually a singular event. And one of the beauties of the trick is that this then seems like it expands over millions and millions of years and trillions of planets, when in fact it's all just a singular moment expressed in a variation of roles. We can also borrow from a movie in terms of Wolfen with the shape-shifting to understand that everything up here can shape-shift because it's all made by this. The roles are made by this, the form is made by this. And borrowing from another movie like in War Games with the tic-tac-toe that eventually gets played out, and understanding that there is no winning combination up here, that this can't be successful because it's all founded and orchestrated by the very same experience, the desire for significance, which requires the blocking of memory of truth and establishing the shame, guilt, and terror that becomes the basis of this. And there are dozens of things throughout our arts and literature that express how this seems to be fixable and doable, and yet at the same time comes back to this experience. Up here I can say that this other person is the fault for why I'm upset, or this other person, when they give me praise, understands my significance and specialness and therefore I feel valued. But it's always a tenuous experience, and the other person in turn accuses me or praises me for the very same things. Why? Because in fact we are the very same entity doing the very same thing. Looking at current events also allows us an opportunity to see how the trick, the magic show, is performed. On this level, A person of peace looks at a person of hate, a shooter, a terrorist, a killer, and ascribes to them the need for that person to be healed, and that the person of peace is without any of the attributes that are assigned to the other person. The killer, on the other hand, simply reverses that and assigns the person of peace as being ignorant and the cause of the pain and problems that go on in the world, and therefore is mandated to kill that person. And it becomes this little shell game of a moving around the shame and the blame. And why does that occur? Because it's all connected down here with the shame and the blame occurring and never being fully solved, because the attempt to solve it is played up here in this splitting of those two parts, where each part actually is no different, because each part carries the terror and the shame and the blame and guilt. It merely assigns the other role as being the causal factor, and this is where we get the notion of being a victim and a victimizer, which is the only way that it can be played out, when the ultimate source is this experience of guilt that is designed to block out the memory of love and peace. In fact, one of the roles that we make up is that of here's me and then there is God. And we fail to see that the role that I assign God to is made up by me and comes from the same source material. It is not the true God, because the true God would be the state of non-duality. The God that I make up, again, is assigned a role like everything else that I make up. It's just another finger that appears different from me, when in fact it is conjectured by the same fantasy, the same experience of guilt and shame, and the attempt to dissipate that. In this world of roles, then, where I've made myself this, and I've made God something that is different and separate and apart from me, the same story of victimization plays out. I see myself as a victim of God's victimization, and that might be that either God blesses me or God gives me pestilence and discomfort. So the same act gets played out, and I fail to understand that it is one entity making up itself into multiple projections, each given a role, but the roles are always underneath the shape, underneath the form, the same. And this is what Jesus means by, at some point you'll have to forgive me. Again, understanding that forgiveness means to unlearn. So I see this as me, I see Jesus as this, and what I have to unlearn is that this is not me and this is not Jesus. We are not separate entities. We are projections of the same thing. And what I can choose is to have the willingness to either establish the blocking of the memory of truth and then projecting that and then becoming one and not the other, or I can remember and unlearn that process and then change my willingness from establishing the block to the awareness of love to letting that block go. And that's what Jesus is talking about, is that I'm going to have to forgive, meaning I have to unlearn that this is not me and this is not Jesus, nor is this me, nor is this Jesus. And there is only one of us, united as one singular experience that ultimately melts back into the non-duality that is the truth of peace and love and the memory of God. What we can become aware of, too, is that these are simply coagulations of energy and mass, which are really the same thing, in differing structures and forms, and that they're also interchangeable. It doesn't matter if this role is me or if this role is me, because the consideration is that this is me, so all of the roles, in fact, are me. It's only when I fall back on the separation, which demonstrates how significance works, that this makes me special because I'm not these other people. And then I can compare myself in value and in judgment to everything else. Everything else revolves around my own sense of specialness. But that all disappears when we understand that this is the truth of me. This is the truth of all of these roles. And in fact, this is a false truth too, just as much as this is a false truth, this is a false truth, that the only truth is the non-duality that is God. But we can then become aware of how the trick is played, how the magic act works, that it appears as if this is me, when in fact all of these are me, because this is me as I've established it in rebellion, in resistance to the truth of who I am. So knowing that these are roles and where they come from and what they're intended to do, what that allows me to do is use that understanding and just simply act out my role, live my role, and understand that everybody else has the role that they are intended to to live out, and that it's all made by the same thing. It's all orchestrated and self-chosen, self-directed. So there's really no need to take it seriously and to act as if nothing here is connected or it's different or doing something unusual. There's no reason to despise my role or to dislike somebody else's role. And when I do, what I can understand is that that comes from the shame and the blame and the terror and the guilt that I've placed in my mind to establish this as being significant. So the little willingness also means on this level to be able to look and say that I think that I'm upset because of this person or this event, and what I can do is remind myself that no, this has nothing to do with why I'm upset, and the upset comes from having established this for the purpose of being significant and to block the memory of truth. So the more that I'm able to kind of go through that on practice, that I am not upset because of why I think what I accuse or assign that upset as being caused by up here, that it is merely the cause of upset established here for the purpose to give me my sense of significance. So understanding all of this, that these are roles and what they were intended to do and where my place is in that and where everybody else's place is in that, where it comes from, that we are this singular entity, this hand, this singular experience of guilt, shame, and blame, to block out the memory of truth. Understanding that allows me to be here and do what my role asks of me to do without giving it as much drama, certainly lessening the experience of shame and blame and terror and looking for praise and the experience of lack and everything that goes on in the world that we've established with ourselves in it. So that's the beauty of this practice, is that I understand where all that comes from. I can remove the blame from up here. I can understand where the shame comes from, and I can understand that I no longer walk the shame and can remember then the truth. When we look at these roles that are played out in our world too, we can borrow from films and understand what's going on. When we look at Groundhog Day and understand that this is all just repetitious over and over again, or Interstellar, how time folds back in on itself and past, present, and future are in fact one event. That this is an instant that seemingly gets played out with the trick of time and space. Or the shape-shifting that occurs in Wolfen, that it's nothing shocking when we see that this becomes shape-shifting into all of this. So it's really not stunning when we have made up the entire thing and can change it at will. Or to borrow from Tomorrowland, bits and pieces of that, also with the indication of time travel and how it becomes very illusionary and we can seem to manipulate time and events, but what is really occurring is just simply this singular event of experience of shame and guilt, and then projected out into this play with roles assigned to it. And that there's really nothing more than that going on. And further, the futility of this becomes evident when we, again, borrow from the film War Games, where the computer plays tic-tac-toe and establishes that there is no winning combination up here. There is nothing that significantly changes, only on the level of forms, and the roles switch around, but the source of it all remains the same, and the singular entity, the singular experience, with the sole purpose of blocking out the memory of truth and establishing significance. So obviously then all the projections of that, all the fingers, all the roles then are going to act out that source material. So then this becomes very easily understandable with all the horrors and the attempts at good, the relationships that we have up here, seemingly ignorant of both the united part of it and the singular experience that it comes from. And the purpose of that, which is to block the memory of truth. Or the movie Altered States, where in the very end a person simply disappears into what he or she comes from, which is just light, and in the movie instead the person, with the attempt at a story of love, pulls the person back from becoming light and establish them as a body. When in fact what would be more loving is to simply let everything go and return to the light from which they came.